everybody. Thanks for joining us again on another episode of the Alex Hayes Podcast. I am your host, Alex Hayes. With me today is a very special guest, Natalie Knight-Wickens. She is a business lawyer from the UK. She is a mergers acquisitions professional advisor. She helps business owners with exit and succession strategy, and she is here to share insights and wisdom of all things contracts. So with that, Natalie, thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Alex. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So I found you via LinkedIn. You have a very strong profile on LinkedIn with all kinds of great educational content that I really fell in love with. And it resonated very deeply with me because I feel like we are on the same mission. So before we get into who we help, let's talk a little bit about who Natalie is. Can you take us back? Let's go back a little bit. Who were you in primary school?
Oh, wow. Well, I was in primary school a long, long time ago. But I suppose at primary school, hopefully I was a good friend. I was certainly a geek. I was never in trouble. And I've always had a love for learning and learning new things, which I think is why, A, I've become a lawyer, and B, I have my sort of external interests as sort of chair of governors and as a non-executive director in education companies.
That's amazing. Yeah, no, I could definitely see that. Right. You have all kinds of great vibes coming off of you right now. So let's talk about your personal journey. You went to university and you studied to be an attorney, correct?
Correct. So, my background is prior to that, I was at a state school, which, in the English system, sort of a government-run school. I wasn't at a sort of an independent or a private school. So I came from quite sort of a normal background. And I do think, if you work hard and if you want it enough, these kind of professions are accessible to everyone. And again, that's the reason why I love education. I think education is a wonderful way, you can really better yourself and better your family. So after being at school, I then went to university. I did a 3-year law degree. I then did what's called a legal practice course, which is meant to teach you about the law. And then you start off doing what's called a training contract. It's a bit like an apprenticeship. Now, this is all well and good, but most people who've done it know that, in the words of a dentist, I learned everything about teeth, but nothing about how to get clients in the chair, which I think is very true. You learn everything about the law, but really nothing about how to use the law to help people. That is what you learn. You're actually on the job.
I love it. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. So what did you do after you got people into your proverbial dentist chair?
Well, I think that is where, the law, as a lawyer, you become so much more valuable over time. Almost the more qualified your lawyer is, something the more valuable they are, because the more clients they've seen, the more scenarios they've seen, things have gone well, things have gone badly. And also, I think, when you have outside interests as a lawyer as well, I run my own business separately. I've also, I've sat on boards. And I think sometimes knowing what it's like to be the client as well makes all the difference in how the experience is. Everybody expects their lawyer to know the law, but it's the other bits around it, how to work a client relationship, how actually negotiations progress in real life. That's very rarely is the case where actually, there's just one winner and everyone else goes away. If you can make everybody happy to some extent, that's the best negotiation you can have.
Wow. Yeah, no, I think I agree 100% with that. And tell me a little bit about your journey back in these early days when you started professionally. And when did how did you get into practicing law? And then how did you branch out? When did you branch out into entrepreneurship and have your own businesses? Talk to us a little bit about your journey, your personal story.
Okay, thank you. So, I was a lawyer working for various different firms for about 15 years. And I live in Hertfordshire, which is sort of just outside of London, for anyone familiar with the UK. So a lot of my working career, I worked in the city. And I think that's actually a really good place to earn your stripes. For a lot of young lawyers, if you do work in these sort of sausage factory type firms, you will see so much churn, so much work, so many documents that, again, over time, that is how you perfect your craft. Then it got to a point, I became a mother. It was unsustainable for me as a mother of sort of 2 children under 2 to still be working those long hours in the city. Around that time, there's also COVID. So a lot of us were sort of moving and working from home anyway. And then the opportunity came up at Spencer West, where I currently am. And there, what we do is we all run our own businesses, but under the Spencer West banner. And so it's taught me a lot about entrepreneurship and how running my own small business, also run a sort of small real estate business with others. And also, as I said, I sit on boards. I think all of around it teaches you, when you're ready for entrepreneurship and also how to help others who are also starting an entrepreneurial journey.
I love it. That's such a great experience. I mean, you went through basically 15 years of the grind and of the fire and the testing, and now you're at you're would you call Spencer West a boutique firm, like something that is it's a very special, unique firm in the UK?
So, I mean, I probably wouldn't say it's boutique, and we now have offices all over the world, and we are also quite aggressively expanding, into the USA, into Europe, into the Caribbean. This business model, where there's a lot of sort of independent sort of specialists working under the banner, actually works really nicely. It means.
Interesting.
It means that, when people want a lawyer, if they sort of call me or WhatsApp me, they always get me. If they don't get, a sort of a receptionist whose sole job it is to say, "Oh no, I'm sorry, Mr. and Mrs. So and so isn't available until 3 weeks on a Tuesday." I also say to clients, with this kind of model where we're working from home a lot, you're not paying for fancy client biscuits, which nobody eats anyway. So I think the model of consultancy law works really well, and it is massively spreading.
Interesting. No, thank you for the education. And let's go back just a little bit here. And before we get into Spencer West a little bit more, talk to us about some of those early experiences, that 15-year period of you were testing and perfecting your craft in law. What were some of those major stories that shaped your learning and your lessons and molded you into a business attorney, but also entrepreneur today?
Okay, so I think the first one is that the danger when you sort of work in the sort of the larger firms is that you don't see the whole picture of the transaction the whole time. And I think where I still see transactions fall down nowadays is, we have an expression due diligence. I'm sure you have it in the USA as well, but when you're sort of trying to find out information about a company before you buy it, and the buyer's team will ask a load and load of questions. But sometimes, if all your job is to endlessly do the due diligence, you're asking more and more and more questions. But sometimes the sellers don't have the answers. Often the seller is considerably smaller than the buyer, and it's having that bigger picture, which I think you only develop over time. And I have sympathy with that, because now when I'm looking at transactions, often I do act for the smaller guy, and I can see, where they get bombarded with these questions. And I think, well, actually, it's not really them. It is just this sort of big due diligence machine.
Interesting. And you definitely helping to see the seeing the big picture helps a lot when you're going through this process, I'm sure. Right? Because every deal is probably a little bit different, right?
Yes, I think every deal is a bit different, but also every deal is a bit the same. And so, I mean, I'm personally sector agnostic in a lot of the work that I do, because I do think, when you are the lawyer, you're looking for the same few areas every single time. I think, as a lawyer for the sellers, you're looking sort of limit the seller's liability, the seller's exposure. And how we would do that, regardless of the industry, is the same in almost every single document. We would limit the time limits for exposure. We would limit the monetary amount of exposure. And we also have in place in English law what's called disclosure letter, where, we give, the buyer an awful lot of information in advance. And then the buyer can decide, whether they want to go ahead or not based on that information. The opposite side, if we're acting for the buyer, we look for the same things every time. Where are the key risks? How can we limit that? A very popular way of limiting that at the moment is when the buyer pays some of the purchase price on day one and more of a purchase price over time. That way, if skeletons come out of the woodwork, they still have some money they've held back.
Mm.
Other ways are also, again, increasing the time limit where sellers can have potential exposures or liabilities, and the buyer working hard, to actually do sort of a good audit of what they've bought almost as soon as they've bought it.
So, yeah, going through this due diligence process with a fine tooth comb, and it depends on who you're advising, whether the buyer or the seller
Yeah.
side. Kind of depends on the tip of the spear.
Yes, exactly.
Got it. Okay. And what maybe you could share with us, because more for my own curiosity, what was like the craziest thing you saw when you worked at the big firm in London? Like, what like the craziest story you saw from in a business owner perspective?
I think the craziest thing is how quickly some deals can get completed.
Okay.
The craziest deal I had on was we were acting for actually the company, which was our client, was a Canadian client, but they were actually, being sold to an English company. And pretty much the deal had to be completed in a week. And I'm sure for most of the point during that week, the principal from a buyer and a seller were off exploring all the different bars around London, whilst the rest of us, were working every hour God sent.
That's funny. Yeah. A lot of whining and dining, as they say, right?
Indeed, indeed.
Okay. So now let's move a little bit to your entrepreneurial efforts, right? Your personal stuff. Talk to us about your personal entrepreneur journey and what has that looked like, and what are some of those big pieces of wisdom and insight that you've gained from your personal experience that you now help your clients with?
Okay, thank you. So I've been an entrepreneur now for about 5 years. So I think what I have learned is the first year will always be rubbish. Pretty much any business that you do, the first year, you'll make very little money and you'll feel bad about yourself an awful lot of the time. That's just part of the course. I think whatever you do, it's almost, yeah, you're just starting from scratch again and just sort of build up that contact book again. The areas where I think, are really important for entrepreneurs are, I think you need to have a really good accountant. So you're in control of the numbers and you know what's going on in your business. I slightly shoot myself in the foot in that almost every deal I have on, I say to potential new clients, if you can only afford a good lawyer or a good accountant, go for a good accountant. But I fundamentally mean it, because if the numbers don't add up, it just won't work if you've got no control over how that works. And I think that's a massive thing for entrepreneurship. Actually, you're in charge of the numbers now. Then I think, don't underestimate, the importance of actually sort of putting yourself out there on the socials and actually trying to drum up some business, for your own enterprise. I'm very active on LinkedIn, which is how you found me. I'm also active on Instagram. I think that don't be afraid to put yourself out there. I think naturally we're quite bashful people, aren't we?
Absolutely.
So I think that's really important. I don't think the sort of social media is just for, this is what I'm wearing today, this is a workout I did. It can also be a lot about educating people. I think, smart education is a really good way, to get clients in. Then
And
thirdly, I think it's that sort of smarter, not harder approach to work, which is very, very hard. But I think it's also trying to learn from the experts. I've done quite a lot of coaching over time, and I think it's money invested in yourself on an entrepreneurial journey is really money well spent.
awesome. Yeah, what was some of the best money you spent on yourself? What were some of those best skills that you purchased and educated yourself on?
Okay, I mean, everybody who knows LinkedIn and knows Laura Acosta, who sort of misses LinkedIn. And I think the money that I spent on her course was amazing. That has really sort of changed. 'Cause again, everybody expects you to know the law. It's sort of how you present it, how you make it accessible to people. And where I've
Mm,
tried to position myself in the market is that there's hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of legal experts in Britain. I don't trust to be the only one. What I do is, what makes me unique is how I break it down to people. What makes me unique is I do it, in addition to sort of being a working mother, in addition to sort of running another business, in addition to other, entrepreneurial interests that I have. Uh, I don't think of myself as like an ivory tower lawyer, but sometimes, it's hard to get that across to people. So, because there's that sort of, you don't want to blow your own trumpet too much on social media, but I think to the extent you can say, these are sort of my unique attributes. This is me, take it or leave it. There will always be some people that love you and some people that don't. But then I couldn't service, every client in Britain. No lawyer could. There's always going to be somebody who's right for somebody else.
that's powerful. The LinkedIn course and helping with your storytelling and your presentation was one of the biggest things that helped you in your entrepreneurial career in your
Yes,
practice.
yes, for
That's awesome.
sure.
I agree. The power of storytelling is so it really is a game changer. And because so many people are just not very good at telling a story, they may be good at a technical craft, but communicating their proficiency is very hard, right? And until you experience it. So people that have the ability to, especially like yourself, you definitely have this ability to break down complex topics. You boil it down to first principles, and then you tell it in a language in which is broadly understood by the, we'll say, majority of people. So, and again, I think we resonate on the mission a lot because you definitely speak to, helping to educate people first. The question I want to ask is, in negotiating an exit, how do you deal with the human element of the business owner? Because a lot of times business owners get the identity of themselves tied so much to the business. When you're advising your clients, how do you approach the emotional aspect of the exit and helping them get to what they want?
I think that is a great question. And that is the kind of thing where it changes every single time. It so much depends on experience. And I think, if you can give, a seller a good experience to exit, I think a lot of that also depends on who their buyer is. Certainly in the UK, a market that, I'm quite active in is called ETA, Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition, where you get a lot of people who sort of take over existing businesses. And that's a bit in contrast to say, buy and build, where you have these sort of big companies that come along and sort of swallow up the littler companies.
Mm.
So I think, what is really important to sellers, I know they've been having this business for a long time, but it goes to a good home. But actually, who is going to take it over will actually sort of love that business and will look after that business. That's really important. I think it's really important if the buyer sort of treats them with respect and looks after how the business has been run. And I think things that sellers can do to sort of improve that experience are also, I think it's also being realistic about the valuation they can get for that business. Because in reality, a lot of people who run smaller businesses do run it a bit like a lifestyle business over time. There have been sort of money is taken out for various issues. And I think it's just getting to grips with that and what that would be in advance of the sale. Doing that exercise, with your accountant, your broker will make a massive difference. And then just sort of accepting that, again, a lot of sellers do like to stay on for a period of time, sort of a run-off period where they will teach, the buyer how the business works. And this can be really useful for both parties. It's really useful for a buyer in sort of finding out how the business works. They can make it a success. It can be really useful for the seller in the sense that, as I said, often, we have elements of what's called deferred consideration. So monies that are paid at a later date. So the seller's almost got a foot in the door to see what's going on still. But where I've seen that go wrong is, the seller's been used to being a boss and running it a certain way for, say, 20 or 30 years. And then, they'll ring me and say, oh, but something that's happened. I've got to say, you're not the boss anymore. Actually, yeah, but the boss probably is quite a lot younger than you now. And perhaps they want to, automate all the invoicing, and this is done a different way. And you've just got to ride it out. You are there as a consultancy capacity for the next 6 months or whatever, but you're not the boss anymore.
How do you prepare them for that? Is it just talking to them? Do they need continual reminder? Like, do you have a process that you walk them through to make sure that they're ready to handle that huge identity shift of being the boss and then no longer being the boss and just watching their thing just being run by somebody else? Like, how do you approach that's very sensitive topic?
I think it's a very, like I said, it's a sensitive topic and a hard one, because until someone's in that situation, they don't know they're going to be in that situation. So I think it's making for the seller, making the seller aware of that, and B, making from a buyer, just saying actually from the start, be aware, this is likely to happen.
Mm.
And I also say a lot to buyers, if you've got a sort of 6-month run-off period with a seller, be prepared that the seller will be on a cruise for at least 2 to 3 weeks during that period. Because that happens almost 99% of the time. And why
Oh,
not?
wow.
If I'd made a lot of money selling my business, I'd be on a cruise.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. So yeah, that to me is one of the hardest aspects of selling, small business owners in particular, selling a business that they've been working in for decades. Right. So I think it's important to raise a lot more attention to that aspect of the sale. And because a lot of people, especially on social media, you've seen them sell your business now, buy a business, do, business valuations. It's all, everything on social media that I've seen is a lot of focusing on the transaction and not the person. And the person, I think, has to be really prepared to go through that process. If they're not prepared, then then the whole thing's not going to work because
Yeah.
they won't finish. They won't go through. So let's talk about some creative deal structures. I'm curious to see what do you see from deal structure terms that you're seeing with your clients? Is it mostly just 100% buyouts? Are they doing step up equity? Are they doing selling partial? Are they deferring it? Like what kind of creative structures are you seeing?
What I see a lot is consideration being deferred over a period of time. So basically, if we just have a very simple example, if a purchase price is 4 million, I'd say see 1 million paid on day one and the other 3 million paid, over the next sort of 2 to 3 years. And I think that is directly linked to a fact that, there's a lot of young buyers coming up, but they're not cash rich. And for a lot of sellers, I think they have to accept that actually there isn't this cash rich generation coming along that can buy these businesses. It is something that has to be done over time. Now,
Interesting.
during that period of time, of course, there's the issue where, if the sellers sell 100% of their shares to a buyer, then that's a lot of money out there on trust, so to speak.
Mm,
So where, we try to put in legal protections, there's various sort of charges and things they can have. Sellers can have, say, charges over, say, the assets or charges over shares of the company. So shares can be transferred back to them if actually a buyer doesn't pay on time. Similarly, so from a buyer's perspective on the other side, a very popular way of doing it is called an earn-out, which basically means that, the seller gets paid money over time and it's contingent on how much money the business actually makes moving forward. So say, for example, the seller says, this is an amazing business, they will make X, Y, and Z over the next 2 to 3 years. If in fact, actually, a lot of material contracts don't come to fruition or whatever, then that will be directly reflected in the purchase price.
okay. And there's a generation of hungry buyers, but they're not cash rich. They're not cash flush. They don't have the capital to buy outright. And so you're seeing a transfer of ownership from older generation to younger generation in a structured, methodical way that kind of balances the playing field and allows for that transaction.
Yes, for sure. There are loads of graphs on it. I can't think one off the top of my head. There's a massive graph showing that actually, so many small businesses in the UK are owned by people, say, they're 60 or over. And a lot of them are like, they've worked hard all their lives. Naturally, they're looking to sort of divest. And
Yeah.
there's also this group of sort of, young people in the sort of 20s, 30s, 40s. And they're like, well, hang on, I'm a bit disenchanted with employment. I've worked very hard for someone else just to take the profits. Why am I not doing it for myself? There's so much literature out there. If you look at many of the greats like Hormozy, there's so much good literature out there about how to just sort of take the bull by the horns and go and do it yourself. I think there's a really inspired generation out there. I don't think it's still fair to say that sort of young people are lazy. I think they're just not cash rich, but they are looking for opportunities. And I think this is a brilliant opportunity for them.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. I think I'm curious to see how the trends continue to play out with Generation Z in the United States. It seems like there's a lot of this latest generation to go back to the trades, right? They're becoming plumbers, electricians, carpenters, masonry. They're going back to an actual trade, a technical trade when building with their hands rather than get a desk job. So I think the generation, I agree. I don't think they're lazy. I think they are looking for opportunity. But it does have to make sense. It can't be something that they can't achieve. I think what you're saying, we're also seeing here in the US. Right. Most of the business owners are still baby boomers, right? So they're
Yeah.
65, 75 years old, but they are looking to get out. So we're seeing a similar demographics UK, US. So when you take on a client and you are going through this process, what's your client onboarding process look like to help prepare the seller to get themselves and their business ready? Let's talk a little bit about maybe pre-diligence instead of due diligence. Let's talk a little bit about your pre-diligence process. How do you go about that with your clients?
Okay, so I think the main things to look at this stage are the sort of material contracts that any business has. because that is a big issue for what the buyer is going to be buying. Particularly, I mean, if there's sort of 2 or 3 very large contracts, we'd have a look, when do these contracts need to be renewed? What are the terms in these contracts? And for example, if a business has got like lots of smaller contracts, we might look at their terms and conditions of business, so I say they regularly send out to say what is in these. Or if it transpires, which is my worst nightmare, a client just says to me, "Oh, we always contract on the other party's standard terms, it's fine." Then we try and look and see, what exposures are there or not. Now, in reality, if you do a huge volume of deals with all different people over time, probably there's very little exposure there. But if you have a few consistent clients that bring in an awful lot of your revenue, and that's what a buyer's going to be looking for, that is where you want to make sure that the terms and conditions are tight. But it's clear that when the payment terms are, it's clear where you're limiting any exposures or liabilities. So that is an area you always look at. And I also think, a big financial health check with your accountant is good. There's a lot of occasions, for example, if there are directors' loans, dividends, excess cash in a business, the best ways of taking out excess cash in a business, what happens if you run things through business, perhaps, not entirely business related, all of that, your accountant can clear that up for you in a very legitimate way, in plenty of good time. And then I think it's also establishing a relationship, with a good broker if you're thinking of going through a broker to get towards a sale. And finding someone that actually has your best interests at heart and not just commission at heart.
Great. So that's your 1, 2, 3. Let's
Yeah.
go through contracts. Let's see customer concentration and make sure your T's and C's are right. Then you say, let's look at your numbers. Let's make sure that the books are clean, that you're not running personal finances through the business. And then you look at making sure they have a good advisory support, and go through that, go through that process, right? To make sure that they're ready to with the right advisory team. That's
Absolutely.
it. Okay. Perfect. No, I think those are great. What are some of the ways that small business owners are typically exposed that they may not be aware of? What do you find the most often of risk in contracts and in the terms and conditions?
The risks are that I think if you are the little guy, you can get railroaded into signing up to other people's terms and conditions of business. And very often the risks there are around payment terms being very slow. I think, cash flow is king for every single business. If you sign up to payment terms where, you're paid, after 90 days, even longer, it can be really hard for small businesses to keep going on those type of agreements. And another area is around liabilities and exposures. What happens if something goes wrong? And then if the business has intellectual property, we want to be careful. We don't inadvertently transfer over IP that but A, they don't need, and B, we do need. Often this can be done by a way of simple licensing rather than actually transferring intellectual property inadvertently.
Interesting. So they look at payment terms. Payment terms are the biggest one that people are leaving themselves exposed to because they're just trying to sign contracts just because they think they have to. And then making sure that they're not signing away IP, intellectual property, in a way that's just going to transfer it over unnecessarily.
Correct. And also opening themselves up to any other liabilities for faults if things are wrong with the product, etc. There's just
Mm.
you just still limit, if you're providing a service or providing a product, then where at all possible, your company's limitation, it should be limited, to the value of what you've provided.
I love it. Yeah, no, for sure. Make sure your limits of liability are just the monies that were exchanged and nothing more. They can't come after you for any other damages, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, perfect, perfect. And now let's talk a little bit about operating agreements and governance structures, because you've had a number of recent posts lately that I've seen, or at least come across, that talk about business partnerships gone wrong, and how often does that come up? And then what are some of the key things that business owners that are in a partnership need to maybe look at their agreements or their operating structure and say, hey, we need to make sure let's come back to the table now, or before emotions get involved, and let's make sure that these are hammered out now while we're both still friends. What are some of those things that you see?
Mm. The main things I see are what happens, like you said, if something goes wrong, if people fall out. There is no automatic right under English law that if you fall out that one person can buy the other one out. And so often we get the case where there's a sort of stalemate and they can't agree what's going on. There's also no automatic right under English law that, if one party's running a competing business or if their performance hasn't been up to scratch, you can get rid of them. And so all of these kind of things, wherever possible, I would encourage, sort of founders of businesses to put in place a shareholders agreement. This will not only set out, how the business is run, but also what happens, if you fall out, or what happens, if somebody's run over by a bus, or, what happens, if you fall off a horse or something. I know it sounds a bit crazy, but it's a bit like a sort of a prenuptial agreement, but for a company. Because it's always much easier and also much, much, much cheaper to discuss these things with your friends than later. If you have a dispute and you go all the way to court, normally what the court will say is, okay, Mr. X would buy out Mrs. Y's shares at a value, to be agreed by a valuer. But again, any valuation, is an art rather than a science. Unless, your business is, say, real estate or perhaps professional services, which can be sort of quite sort of cleverly calculated as what it would be. For most businesses, a valuation is an art, not a science. And so to some extent, you've just got to agree something. Keep sort of commercial about it and agree something. But if you can at all have parameters, in a shareholders agreement, it will make it so much easier, if one party, wants, to go forward without the other or vice versa.
And so what are those, the top 3 line items in the shareholders agreement that you think absolutely people need to make sure that they have? Like, what are those, the high level 1, 2, 3, if these need to be there?
So number 1 is what happens if you fall out.
Fallout.
Yes. 1 is fallout. Number 2 is limiting who you can transfer the shares to. So, if one party wants to leave, they should have to offer it to the other parties first. And number 3 is what happens if a shareholder's been misbehaving? How do you get rid of that shareholder?
Interesting. Yeah. So 1, 2, 3, make sure that you avoid any unpleasant conversations and any, like, I don't know if you use the same, we call it squishiness, right? So it's too squishy. You can't really, it's not clearly defined one way or another. It's very, very murky. So making sure that you make that in the event that you have a falling out of the relationship, that the business has a way of surviving.
Absolutely.
Percent. So let's talk now a little bit about some experiences. Let's hear some stories, right? What were some maybe some examples of major failures of business negotiations in your business consulting clients? What were some failures there that other people can learn from, maybe the type of situation? Obviously, names and specifics will be withheld, right, for legal purposes. But talk to us about an example story to help drive home the point of looking at your contracts and understanding where you're at risk as a business owner.
Okay, so I think it's really important to understand your financials as a business owner. I think that's the number 1 tip I can give to any entrepreneur, is to try and get on top of your finances to the extent that you can. Where I think I see deals come unstuck actually is not so much around contracts, because things can be amended, things can be agreed. But if the numbers don't stack up, if what the buyer thought they were buying, after a serious amount of number crunching, it's actually significantly decreased, all they're going to do is either, offer the seller a lower price and will walk away from the deal. So if this is not sorted out right at the start, then if it's sorted out towards the end, I've seen this happen literally at the 11th hour, just before we're about to complete a deal. And all that's happened is everyone's spent an awful lot of time, money, blood, sweat and tears, only for it not to work, because the purchase price isn't what they thought it would be. And a lot of that, with having sort of a few good sessions with your accountant, prior to sale, could probably save a lot of time and effort.
And so it happens a lot more than people think, where they get to the very end and it's they've knuckled this contract and they've wrestled going back and forth, and then the final number is not what they were expecting.
Correct. I do say to clients, with my experience, I think that actually, if you have the time for a deal, try and do some financial due diligence before you bring the lawyers in to do their bit. Deals don't always have the time to do that, but I think if the numbers work, we can get the contracts to work. What you don't want is the most beautifully drafted contract, but then the deal falls through because the numbers aren't what people think they are.
Yeah, then the only ones that make money are the lawyers and the accountants, right?
Exactly. So if people want to do that and give them their money, they're very welcome. I'd just like to say that. But I do feel, with my experience, that is what I always advise clients. If they have the time and or if they're cost conscious, then I would very much suggest, do a period of financial diligence first with the legals to follow.
That's excellent. And so that's a good follow-up question for this then is how soon prior to starting this process should people start looking at their business and doing that pre-diligence before they start listing their business for sale? Like what would be your recommended timeline for business owners to start doing their own pre-diligence?
I think as soon as the idea pops in their head, they might want to sell in, say, 12 months, 3 years, etc. There isn't a too early time to start because, the better your contracts and your numbers are, the easier it is for a buyer. It's not dissimilar to, if your house needs work and you want to sell in the future. If you make it look nice, and if a buyer will think, oh, this is easy, I can just walk in. If something's broken, you haven't fixed it for, say, 3 years, then they always think it's a bigger job than it actually is to do it.
Yep. Absolutely. True story, though. When I was getting ready to sell my house, we fixed all the things that I had been ignoring for over a decade. And then there was a moment where I looked around and I was like, you know what? Why am I selling this? This is a nice place. Which it could happen too. Could happen too. Maybe you look at your business and you get into it and you're like, wow, maybe I don't want to sell this business. Maybe I want to keep it.
Exactly. And I do have clients that have said that actually, going through a process. And it also, I would say, it's always really got to think, when you're looking for a lawyer or any type of professional advisor, to shop around a little bit as well. Find out who you get, a good vibe from. And I have had clients, I said to them, I don't really think you should sell your business. My professional opinion, I don't think now is the time for you. And people have appreciated that. Yeah. Whether they've secretly gone and sold it with somebody else, I don't know. But I feel, where an advisor can add value is actually to say that if I don't think it's the right time for whatever reason.
So and maybe this is a good question too. What are the common characteristics of a business owner that is ready to sell? What are some of those signs that the business owner themselves can say, hey, if I'm feeling like this or I'm starting to think like this, maybe I should consider moving in this direction? What are some of those commonalities that you see amongst your clients that have gone through that transaction process?
I think they've started to detach themselves from the business. Certainly in the UK, a business that can run without you is gold dust for a buyer. They love and to the seller where you're not involved in every single thing all the time, where you start to put those processes in place. Almost as that detachment in your mind, and it makes it easier with a buyer as well. That is number one. I think number two for a lot of sellers is coming to terms with the fact there's no sort of internal succession within the family or within the business as it currently is run. So they have to find someone external. And I think third is just, sort of the passage of time. People want to do different things over time. Perhaps, spend more time with grandchildren or more time traveling. Or sometimes it's a case that actually a tragedy has happened and there's just one partner left. I want something different from my life now. The clock is ticking.
Time becomes a big factor.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I think that's super solid advice for people to start. If you're feeling the weight of the clock, maybe you should consider moving and start thinking about moving in this direction, right? Great points there. Great points. Now, you mentioned family business, and I was reading your bio that you also help family businesses with succession strategy and planning. Tell me a little bit about that aspect, because it's a little different than an exit, right? Because the family dynamic is always there. There's always, there's an unspoken hierarchy, right, of patriarchy or matriarchy that's
Yeah.
built inside of a family, right? That's just innate in most cultures. But talk to us about how you approach succession planning, and what are some of those differences that are a little bit different than an exit plan, right, to an outside party?
Well, I run a family business as well. So I think I'm sort of quite well placed to understand, also from a business owner's side, how they feel about sort of family businesses. And you're right, there's a lot of dynamics in there, which, again, No one teaches that of a textbook. That is what you learn over time. I do think, there's an awful lot of scaremongering around, oh, if you put nothing in place, when you die, the government will take all your money. And there's a lot of strategies of ways that, that can be avoided, with proper planning. I've got some colleagues who are very good and specialists in this area. We would work together, put in place sort of company structures and how that can work, with wills, with trusts, how to pass shares tax effectively, how to pass other assets tax effectively. And that kind of thing is very bespoke and very different to every client. But there's a lot of information on the internet about there, whilst there's some weird stuff, there's also a lot of good stuff out there as well. Again, I think for something like that, if you're considering, some kind of succession planning strategy, speak to somebody sooner rather than later. A lot of these things, we put it in place now. It's the cheapest that to put in place, and it's the most tax efficient to put it in place now and leave it over a period of time.
Interesting. And so what are some, maybe walk us through some of the high level strategies that business owners in succession planning have at their disposal? You talked about wills and trusts and stuff like that, but can you go into any more detail on maybe what are the most common types of strategies to protect generational wealth and businesses?
So, as I was putting in place a kind of a company structure where, not only as sort of, let's say, mum and dad shareholders, but also the children are shareholders, and the transferring of shares over time. There are quite tax efficient ways to transfer shares and also sort of dividend and other income through shares. That can be quite a tax efficient way of doing it. Then there's the trust regime in the UK. Where there are more significant assets, a trust can be a really valuable way of doing it. And where I think, a good professional comes into their own, they'll give that sort of risk reward, the price of sort of setting up and running the trust, because there are sort of running costs associated with it. Compared to how much tax you will save over time. And there's also the sort of basics around just actually having a will in place, setting out, what you want to happen, to your assets when you go. And your will writer will be able to discuss, various, tax-free gifts you can give now and over time. Where you have small amounts of disposable income that you don't need, again, there are really tax-efficient ways, of divesting yourself of these, and your professional can help you with that.
Interesting. And what size businesses would need to start thinking about putting something like this in place? Like, is this a quarter million pound revenue business? Is this a 500,000? Is this 1 million? What revenue level per se is a good benchmark for business owners to start considering these type of tax efficient strategies?
Honestly, in the UK, business, even if you've got £1 in your bank account, whatever you have there, because obviously, again, housing prices have gone through the roof, everyone's got expensive assets in their life. I would highly recommend, if you're at all concerned, to speak to somebody. There are various inheritance tax thresholds in the UK, and a lot of people are way close to them than I think they may be, because these thresholds haven't really moved over time, but the value of everything we own has just skyrocketed.
Interesting. And what are some of what are some of those upper limits?
So what we have is, where we have limits in place, what seems to change all the time is whilst these limits stay the same, what increases are, the value of your home, the home that you live in. That can go up. The value of actually the monies in your bank account, the value of the price of your shares, of other assets you might have in the home. All of these kind of things, a lot of people are very surprised at actually how much they have and how little, is, sort of protected. But by putting a goodwill in place, you can protect a lot of that, quite easily. You don't need to put in place complex company structures or trust structures if you feel it's not right for you.
Excellent. I appreciate that. So, what are some of the ways that family businesses can look and decide of understanding the difference between what's fair and then what is fairness and equal, right? So, I'll start this question again. Fairness and equality, right? In a business, in a family business with multiple siblings or multiple children, the subject always comes up of what's fair is not necessarily equal. Right. A fair distribution doesn't mean that everybody gets, if there's 4 kids, everybody gets 25%. right? That's not that even though it's equal, it doesn't actually equal fairness. How do you guys look at the equality versus fairness debate inside of a family business, and how do you approach that subject?
Okay, so where all of the parties are aligned, then as a solicitor, we can act for the company. So, we would take everyone's instructions. Where the parties are not aligned, everyone has to get different legal representation, but that can get incredibly expensive.
Mm,
And I think it can depend on, how much money there actually is in that business. To some extent with families, you'll always want someone being slightly more hard done by than others. I think that is just part of the course of life. There
yeah.
are ways that people can get sort of different classes of shares, different amount of dividends, different amount of money, when the business is sold or shares are transferred over time. So you don't have to be treated equally in a company structure. You can have it that say, if a company were being sold, that say, all of the kids, which, like children or grandchildren will get a sort of fixed amount each, and any of the surplus is then divided by children or the adults equally or something. There are lots and lots of ways of doing it, but I think it's just come to these discussions with an open mind.
Interesting. If you have in this conversation too, again, family and business is either the best thing or it's the worst thing, right? It's usually not in the middle. So when you're sitting everybody down and one sibling went to business university, he has a business degree, maybe also an attorney, and then you have another sibling. I'm being extreme here, but didn't graduate primary school, right? And they're the two of them are going to be given some portion of the business. Who would how does how do you kind of wrap or advise the parents of these children? you know how do you look at that? Like how do you protect the business and to make sure the business can still generate cash flow for the owners, the parents and the kids, and make sure that there's a smooth transition of power there, like in that kind of situation. I'm just putting out a hypothetical for discussion purposes.
I think things like that can be incredibly tricky to sort out.
Mm,
Because, often the interests of the individuals can be different from the interests of the business. And I think this is a massive reason why we have this sort of baby boomer generation who are selling their businesses now, is because there's a divergence between children of what they want to do. So actually, a lot of parents will actually, we'll just sell the business and we've got the cash, we can sort of give the cash to the children. Where the business keeps going, often I see, a lot of the parents do try to treat children equally in the share they get of a business because that is sort of their inheritance. But
mm,
then that depends a lot, I think, on whether, sort of one or two children are particularly active in a business. If you have someone that's very active in a business, they'd want to have, considerably greater control and a considerably greater amount of shares. And that often can be offset against the other siblings, say, getting other parts of parents' estate when a parent's pass away, like the house or something. But
interesting.
that is very much, sort of, again, an art rather than a science. It's not something as an advice. We can give sort of few options like that, but it is not something that, we can get into great detail. We can't opine and say, I think, this person deserves more, that person deserves less.
Yep, absolutely. I love it. That was a very politically correct answer, and I love it. I can tell you're a very good attorney. You know how to dance there. You know how to dance that line. I like it. Oh, the it's coming to the table with an open mind
Mm,
and understanding if people are in the business versus out of the business, and so it's more what's in the best interest of the company and the family and the company. So what's in the
yes,
best interest of the family comes first. Maybe it's easier to sell the business and distribute the cash. Maybe that's the easiest route to go if we can't come to an accord. But if some businesses can continue and people are willing to have an open mind, but there's creative structures around estate planning in which the business can be passed to adult children that would like to take on the business.
exactly, yes.
Yeah, I think that's super solid. That's very solid. So let's talk a little bit too now about some of the bigger deals that you've consulted on. What was the biggest size business that you helped transact in a sale?
I think that the biggest that I get involved in are really around the sort the 50 million mark. Often I tend to do deals that are sort of considerably smaller than that. I think the deals that are much, much bigger than that tend to sort of go to the larger firms where they have a lot of capacity for people to do them.
And so what's the difference between a 50 million deal mark and then a, let's say a 5 million deal? What are some of those differences that people need to, that, maybe consider?
Well, honestly, I think that an awful lot of the principles remain the same. The principles around what the sellers need to look for to protect themselves, or a buyer looks for to protect themselves, will be the same regardless of the size of the deal. Those legal principles will never change.
So it's more a capacity around so capacity wise, you mean it's capacity of the team size to be able to go through the due diligence, right? Go through all the documentation. Is
Correct.
that the limit?
Yes, correct. I think, the bigger the business, so, the more endless contracts, employees, real estate section they've got. So you really sort of army people to go through it. But ultimately, I think, whatever size deal you've got, you only have sort of, one or two partners. You're pulling the strings from the top because, the main document, the share purchase agreement, will largely be the same regardless of the purchase price in terms of protections that both the buyer and the seller need.
Interesting. And let me get your opinion on this too, because AI is upon us, right? AI is supposed to do a lot of this data analysis on our behalf. How do you see AI fitting into due diligence processes and legal work going forward? Like, what are you seeing inside of your industry?
I think that AI is not there yet. I think it will be. I think already it's improving to what it was, but I do not think that, it can review substantial legal documents. Wherever I have run legal documents through it, I think where it is very good, it's good at picking up, sort of cross-references are wrong. Or, if you've referred, or if you spelt, a party's name, say, with one S in paragraph 1 and with two S's in paragraph 22 or whatever. That it can pick up just like that. But where it tells you there's legal inconsistencies, actually they're different legal concepts, just AI does not have that level of legal knowledge and legal specialism yet. I do think over time it will make a massive difference, but I don't think we are there. An example I have recently of that is that, I had a contract where, I'd used the term share buyback and separately in another place share purchase. And AI's answer was, this is inconsistent, you should use the same term throughout. But actually, they're two entirely different legal concepts under English law, which AI does not have the sophistication to understand. I'm sure at time it will, and I think it'll make a lot of these things quicker, but we're not there yet with the AI tools that, we have available to us.
Interesting. No, I think that analysis is spot on. It's advancing at a rapid clip, but there's no substitute for a professionally trained eye to go over something and be able to understand context. I
Yeah.
think a lot of people think that AI is the silver bullet for a lot of things, and it's great for a lot of things, and then it's really not great if you want to try to rely on it for legal purposes and with a lot of risk. So
I would agree with that. And also, just a little plea, please. The next time somebody wants to send me a document and say, this is a document I've used before, look, you just cast your eye over it. And I can see it's in a chat GPT font and it's never been used before. We're just going to try and save loads of money by doing it. Please don't do that. It's so obvious to me. Often, they're just not fit for purpose. Again, I've said they're not fit for purpose yet. It may be a
yeah.
very different conversation in 5 years, but they're not there yet.
Yeah. Well, I don't try to pretend like I'm used a contract before. I do try to do that with my business attorney. I send him some GPT. I try to put down enough of the terms. And I send it to him, just like, look this over. Let me know what I'm missing. That's how we work that. So
Yeah.
no, I think this has been a great episode. I want to be respectful of your time. I know that you're incredibly busy over there helping all kinds of people with their business needs. But Natalie, what's one piece of first principle advice that you want to leave to business owners that are in the midst of this exit and succession planning or strategy, and looking at this from a business perspective and like, I don't even know where to start? What would be your first principle of wisdom and advice for that legacy minded business owner?
I think if that's the case, if you're not sure, just there's so much advice out there. Just reach out to a professional, somebody that, you think you sort of like the look of, you might go on well with them. I mean, I have so many calls with you aren't ready to sort of, sell yet. They just want, to know a bit about, what would I need to put in place? What would a process look like? How would I want to go ahead and do something? And I think there's lots of advisors who are very happy to have that initial conversation. I think also put yourself in a room with other people like that. A lot of professional services firms or similar, they run a lot of sort of seminars for around this kind of thing. I think knowledge is power. I think whatever age you are, the brain is like a sponge, and you don't know what you don't know. So I think go to things with an open mind and just learn about, when might be a suitable time, or, what the alternatives are.
I love it. Knowledge is power. Make sure arm yourself with the knowledge you need. Reach out to professionals. Give, the information is out there. Don't be afraid to go get it. Awesome. So, Natalie, tell us, where can people find you?
Well, the place you can find me, I know I'm very active on LinkedIn. I'm one of the top legal law influencers. So please find me on LinkedIn. I'm also very active on Instagram, and I have a website. All the links should be below. By all means, contact me. I have a Calendly link, and I'd be delighted to speak to people.
Beautiful. Yeah, we will make sure that all of her links are in the description below of this video. If you are needing legal assistance from the UK, please reach out to Natalie. She is a wealth of information. She is an advocate for you during this time of legal risk and crisis, but just reach out to her and get the help that you need. And yeah, we'll make sure that all your links are down there, and including a Calendly link if you want. We could put it all down there, and we'll make sure that this gets out there. So, Natalie, thank you so much for your time today. This has been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you, Alex.